When a young assistant lands her dream job at a prestigious finance firm, she quickly discovers the dark side of corporate power. Her tyrannical CEO, Marcus Grant, rules with an iron fist, but beneath his polished exterior lies a chilling secret: he's orchestrating a multimillion-dollar fraud scheme. Torn between self-preservation and doing the right thing, she makes the bold decision to expose him, triggering an investigation that topples his empire. But her whistleblowing doesn't come without consequences. As the fallout spirals, she finds herself the target of anonymous threats, shadowy stalkers, and a shocking betrayal by someone she trusted. With Marcus pulling strings even from prison, the stakes escalate to a life-or-death game of cat and mouse. In this gripping tale of justice and revenge, she must navigate betrayal, danger, and fear to not only survive but ensure that the truth finally comes out. Can she stay one step ahead of those out to silence her, or will Marcus's reach destroy her for good? I always believed that hard work and perseverance would eventually pay off. That's what my mom drilled into my head every day growing up. She'd worked 2 jobs most of her life, raising me on her own after my dad left. She was my hero, and if she could manage all of that, I figured I could survive just about anything. When I landed the assistant position at LumenCorp, it felt like everything was finally coming together. It wasn't just a job, it was the job. The kind of position people fight for, especially at a company like LumenCorp, a powerhouse in the financial world. I'd spent months fine-tuning my resume, brushing up on corporate etiquette, and practicing answers for every interview question under the sun. When they called me back with the offer, I cried in my tiny 1-bedroom apartment. "This is it, Mom," I'd said to her over the phone, trying to mask the sound of my voice shaking. "We're finally going to be okay." She told me she was proud, and I believed her. But I also knew what she wasn't saying, that this job was more than just a paycheck. It was a lifeline. The medical bills from her cancer treatment were crushing us, and the stress of juggling them with rent and groceries was like a weight on my chest that never went away. LumenCorp's salary wasn't astronomical, but it was enough to breathe a little easier. At least, that's what I thought in the beginning. My first day at LumenCorp was overwhelming in all the ways you'd expect. The lobby was polished marble, the kind that makes you feel like you're walking into a cathedral instead of an office. Everyone was dressed to the nines, power suits and heels clicking against the floor as they strode with purpose. I felt like an imposter, tugging at the sleeves of my thrift store blazer and hoping no one noticed the scuffs on my shoes. When I was introduced to Marcus Grant, the CEO, my palms were sweating so much I was afraid he'd feel it when we shook hands. Marcus was exactly what you'd imagine a high-powered executive to be: tall, confident, with the kind of charisma that could sell sand in the desert. His smile was sharp, his handshake firm, and his eyes seemed to assess me in an instant, cataloging every strength and weakness before I even opened my mouth. "Welcome aboard," he said, his voice smooth like a politician's. "We're a fast-paced environment here, so I hope you can keep up." "I will, sir," I replied, trying to match his confidence even though I felt anything but. He smiled again, though it didn't quite reach his eyes, and then he was gone, swept away by a team of executives clamoring for his attention. That was the first thing I noticed about Marcus: he moved like a hurricane, always leaving chaos in his wake. At first, I tried to convince myself that the pressure was normal, that the long hours and impossible expectations were just part of working at a company like LumenCorp. But it didn't take long to realize that Marcus wasn't just demanding, he was cruel. He had a way of making people feel small, like we were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. He started calling me Mouse on my second week. It was supposed to be a nickname, I guess, but the way he said it always felt like an insult. If I brought him coffee that wasn't hot enough, he'd roll his eyes and mutter, "Come on, Mouse, do I have to do everything myself?" If I stayed late to finish a report, he'd wave me off with a dismissive, "Good work, Mouse. Maybe next time you'll get it right the first time." The worst part was how everyone else seemed to accept it. My coworkers just shrugged when I mentioned his behavior, saying things like, "That's just Marcus. He's tough, but he gets results. As if that justified the way he treated people. As if it was okay for him to humiliate us just because he was the boss. I told myself it didn't matter. I reminded myself why I was there, my mom, the bills, the chance to build a future. I could endure anything for her. Or at least, that's what I thought. Things came to a head one afternoon when Marcus called me into his office. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk, scrolling through his phone like I wasn't even there. The office itself was a testament to his ego, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline and shelves lined with awards and framed photos of him shaking hands with various politicians and celebrities. "Mouse," he said without looking up. "Do you know why you're here?" I shifted uncomfortably, clutching my notepad like a lifeline. "No, sir." He finally set his phone down and leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he studied me. "I've been hearing some complaints about your work." My stomach dropped. "Complaints?" "Nothing major," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Just that you're not as efficient as you could be. Missing deadlines, asking too many questions, things like that." I opened my mouth to protest, but he cut me off. "Don't take it personally, Mouse. Everyone starts out a little shaky. But if you want to survive here, you need to toughen up. Got it?" "Yes, sir," I said through gritted teeth, my face burning with humiliation. "Good." He picked up his phone again, effectively dismissing me. "Close the door on your way out." I left his office feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. I knew I wasn't perfect, but I'd been working my ass off since the day I started. I stayed late almost every night, skipped lunch to meet deadlines, and bent over backward to keep up with Marcus's demands. And yet, somehow, it was never enough. That night, I stayed late again, finishing up a stack of reports Marcus had dumped on my desk at the last minute. The office was eerily quiet after hours, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound as I worked. I was so focused on my task that I didn't notice Marcus come back into the office until I heard his voice from his private office down the hall. At first, I thought he was on a call, his voice low and urgent as he spoke. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't speaking to anyone else. He was dictating into a recorder, his words sharp and deliberate. "Shift the losses to the overseas account," he said. "Reallocate the funds under the new subsidiary. Keep the bonuses intact, no one will notice until the audit, and by then we'll have moved the money." I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. He wasn't just running the company, he was manipulating it. Committing fraud. Millions, maybe billions of dollars being shuffled around like pieces on a chessboard, all to line his own pockets. I should have left right then and there. I should have pretended I didn't hear anything and walked out of that building without looking back. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could think about was the people this would hurt, the employees, the shareholders, the clients who trusted LumenCorp with their money. And then, slowly, a new thought crept into my mind. What if I did something about it? The air in the office felt heavier after I heard Marcus's words. My hands were clammy, gripping the edge of the cubicle desk I'd been working at. My thoughts were a tangled mess of fear, anger, and uncertainty. He was stealing, no, worse, orchestrating a web of lies so massive it could take down the company. It was fraud, plain and simple, and I had just overheard it. But what could I do? I was nobody, just a lowly assistant with no power, no voice. Marcus Grant was the king of the castle, untouchable. If I confronted him, he'd deny it. If I told anyone, they wouldn't believe me. And even if they did, what then? Marcus had connections everywhere, from boardrooms to political offices. He'd crush me like a bug before I could even explain myself. But as I sat there, staring blankly at my computer screen, a gnawing sense of responsibility began to take hold. It wasn't just the idea of justice that haunted me, it was the faces of the people who worked here. The receptionist who greeted me every morning with a smile, the janitor who always mopped up my coffee spills without a word of complaint, my coworkers who were trying to pay their mortgages and support their families. If Marcus's scheme blew up, they'd be the ones to suffer, not him. I couldn't let that happen. That night, I stayed at my desk long after everyone else had gone home. I told myself I was just finishing up some work, but the truth was, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Every time I thought about walking out the door, I felt like I was abandoning all those people to whatever fallout Marcus's actions would cause. But I didn't have a plan, I didn't even know where to start. Then I remembered his office. His private office, with its locked drawers, towering bookshelves, and the laptop he never let out of his sight. If there was any proof of what he was doing, it had to be in there. My heart raced at the thought. Breaking into the CEO's office wasn't just risky, it was outright insane. If I got caught, I'd be fired on the spot. Worse, Marcus would know I was on to him, and there was no telling what he'd do to keep me quiet. But what choice did I have? I waited until the cleaning crew finished for the night. When the building was silent, I slipped into the hallway and stood in front of Marcus's office door. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle. Locked, of course. I expected as much, but it didn't make me any less anxious. Breaking into a locked office was crossing a line I'd never even thought about before. I thought about my mom. Her hospital bills, the late-night calls where she tried to pretend she wasn't in pain, the way she always told me to be brave, no matter how hard things got. I tightened my grip on the door handle, then pulled a small bobby pin from my pocket. I didn't have any real skills when it came to picking locks, but I'd watched enough YouTube tutorials to give it a try. It took longer than I expected, every click of the lock echoing in the quiet hallway like a gunshot. My nerves were shot by the time I finally heard the faint click. The door creaked open, revealing Marcus's office bathed in dim moonlight from the massive windows. I slipped inside and shut the door quietly behind me. His desk was immaculate, not a single paper out of place. I sat in his chair and opened the laptop sitting in front of me. Unsurprisingly, it was password protected, but Marcus wasn't exactly the most original thinker when it came to security. I typed CO Grant 123 and held my breath. The screen unlocked. It was like opening Pandora's box. Folder after folder of financial records, contracts, and emails popped up in front of me. I clicked on one labeled Confidential, Subsidiary Allocations, and felt my stomach churn as I scrolled through the document. He was moving money between shell companies, disguising massive losses as profits, and using offshore accounts to siphon millions into his personal wealth. There were fake employee names, bogus projects, and enough false documentation to make it look legitimate on the surface. I copied everything I could onto a flash drive I'd brought with me, my fingers shaking the entire time. Every minute I spent in that office felt like a ticking time bomb. What if Marcus decided to come back? What if security checked the cameras and saw me sneaking in? My heart was pounding so loud I was sure someone would hear it. Once the files were copied, I deleted the history of the flash drive being connected to his computer. I couldn't leave any trace that I'd been there. I closed the laptop, returned the chair to its exact position, and quietly slipped out of the office, locking the door behind me. My legs felt like jelly as I made my way back to my desk, the flash drive burning a hole in my pocket. I couldn't believe what I'd just done. I had evidence now, proof that Marcus was committing fraud on a massive scale. But the question still remained, what was I going to do with it? I barely slept that night. My mind raced with possibilities, each one scarier than the last. I could go to HR, but they worked for Marcus, and there was no guarantee they wouldn't bury the evidence to protect him. I could go to the board, but most of them were in his pocket. The idea of going public with the files made me sick to my stomach. If Marcus found out I was the whistleblower, my life would be over. The next morning, I sat at my desk, bleary-eyed and exhausted. Every time Marcus walked by, I tensed up, convinced he somehow knew what I'd done. But he didn't even glance in my direction. He was too busy barking orders at a team of executives trailing behind him like obedient dogs. I spent the entire day researching my options, trying to figure out the best way to expose him without putting myself in immediate danger. That's when I stumbled across a website for the Securities and Exchange Commission. They had an anonymous tip line for reporting financial crimes, with protections in place for whistleblowers. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best I could come up with. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the flash drive plugged into my laptop. My hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. Once I hit send, there would be no going back. Marcus would eventually find out someone had reported him, and it wouldn't take long for him to figure out it was me. But I couldn't back down now. I thought of my co-workers, the families who relied on this company to put food on the table, and the people Marcus was lying to on a daily basis. Someone had to stop him, and if no one else was willing to do it, then it had to be me. I uploaded the files and submitted the tip. The screen blinked once, and then it was done. For a brief moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But it didn't last long. As I closed my laptop and stared at the empty flash drive in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just set something in motion that couldn't be undone. All I could do now was wait. The fallout came faster than I expected. It started with whispers. People in the office talked in hushed tones, glancing nervously at Marcus's office or over their shoulders as if they could feel something brewing. Meetings were rescheduled. Entire departments were called into conference rooms without warning. I tried to keep my head down, pretending I was oblivious to the growing tension, but it was impossible to ignore. Then came the suits. It was a Wednesday morning when they arrived, 2 men and a woman in sharp, dark suits, accompanied by a group of armed security personnel. They marched into the office like they owned the place, flashing badges to anyone who asked questions. The SEC. They were here. My stomach dropped when I saw them. Even though I'd been the one to send the tip, I wasn't ready for it to actually happen. The sight of them made everything feel so much more real. I ducked into a side hallway, pretending to be engrossed in a stack of papers, but my ears were tuned to the chaos around me. The SEC team went straight to Marcus's office. His assistant, Cheryl, tried to stop them, but they brushed past her like she wasn't even there. She stood frozen in the hallway, her face pale as they shut the door behind them. For the next hour, the office buzzed with speculation. People whispered about audits, insider trading, and who might be under investigation. I forced myself to keep working, but my hands shook every time I clicked my mouse. When Marcus finally emerged from his office, flanked by the SEC agents, his expression was pure fury. His face was red, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He didn't look at anyone as they escorted him out of the building, but the tension in his shoulders told me everything I needed to know. He was livid, and probably scared. As soon as he was gone, the office erupted into chaos. People gathered in clusters, exchanging rumors and theories about what was happening. Some looked worried, while others seemed almost gleeful at the prospect of Marcus being taken down a peg. I stayed at my desk, pretending to focus on my work, but my mind was racing. I knew this was just the beginning. The SEC wouldn't have come unless they had solid evidence, and I'd made sure they did. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging fear in the back of my mind. Marcus wasn't stupid. He had to know someone inside the company had tipped them off, and it wouldn't take long for him to start looking for a scapegoat. The next few days were a blur. The SEC continued their investigation, interviewing employees and combing through files. Marcus's absence was like a black hole in the office, his name spoken only in whispers. Cheryl, his assistant, looked like she was on the verge of a breakdown, and I couldn't blame her. She'd been his right-hand woman for years, and now her entire world was crumbling. By the end of the week, the first wave of layoffs hit. Entire teams were let go without warning, their desks cleared out while security stood watch. It was brutal. People cried, begged, and argued, but it didn't matter. The company was in freefall, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. I felt sick watching it happen. I knew I'd done the right thing by exposing Marcus, but the collateral damage was worse than I'd imagined. The people being let go weren't the ones who had committed fraud, they were just innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire. The guilt ate at me, but I couldn't tell anyone the truth. I had to act like I was just as confused as everyone else, even as I watched my coworkers pack up their lives in cardboard boxes. Then the emails started. The first one came late one night, just after I'd gotten home from work. The subject line was blank, and the body of the message contained only 2 words, "I know." My heart stopped. My first thought was Marcus. Somehow, he knew it was me. He must have figured it out, maybe the SEC had let something slip, or maybe he'd found a way to track the files back to me. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but the second email came the next day. This time, it wasn't vague. It included a photo of me sitting at my desk in the office, time-stamped from earlier that week. The message read, "You're not safe." Panic set in. Someone was watching me. But who? Marcus was in custody now. The SEC had officially charged him with embezzlement, wire fraud, and a laundry list of other crimes. He was facing decades in prison, so it couldn't have been him. But he had allies. People loyal to him. People who might want revenge. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak in my apartment, every car passing on the street below made me jump. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, but it didn't help. Whoever was sending those emails clearly had access to me in ways I couldn't control. The next morning, I considered calling the police, but what could I tell them? That I'd anonymously reported my boss for fraud and now someone was sending me cryptic threats. They'd probably laugh me out of the station. Instead, I decided to lay low. I went to work, avoided eye contact with anyone, and kept my head down. Every time my phone buzzed or an email popped up, my stomach twisted in knots, but for a few days, nothing else happened. Then, one night, I noticed someone following me. I was walking home from the subway, clutching my bag tightly against my side, when I felt it, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man in a dark hoodie about 20 feet behind me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. This was a busy city, and people walked the same routes all the time. But when I turned down a quieter side street to test my theory, he followed. Panic set in. My pulse quickened, and I broke into a fast walk, my mind racing through my options. Should I call the police? Duck into a nearby store? Confront him? When I turned the next corner, I spotted a convenience store with bright neon lights and darted inside. The clerk glanced up at me as I entered, but I didn't stop to explain. Instead, I pretended to browse the shelves, keeping one eye on the door. The man in the hoodie didn't follow me inside. He stopped outside the store, standing just far enough away to look like he wasn't waiting for me, but I knew better. I stayed in the store for nearly half an hour, pretending to shop while I kept an eye on him. Eventually, he walked away, disappearing into the night. I didn't go straight home after that. Instead, I doubled back, taking a longer route and constantly checking over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed again. When I finally made it to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, shaking. Whoever was sending the emails wasn't just watching me, they were hunting me. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face another day in that building, not while I was constantly looking over my shoulder. But staying home didn't make me feel any safer. I spent the day pacing my apartment, checking the locks on my doors and windows every hour, and jumping at every little sound. By the time the sun set, I realized something: I couldn't keep living like this. I had made the decision to expose Marcus because I believed it was the right thing to do, but now it was clear I hadn't fully understood the consequences. I needed a plan, a way to protect myself, to figure out who was behind the threats and why they were targeting me. But most of all, I needed to stay one step ahead of whoever was coming for me. I barely recognized myself anymore. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who had aged 10 years in the span of a few weeks. The bags under my eyes, the tension in my jaw, the constant fear gnawing at my insides, it was all catching up with me. But I couldn't let it stop me. Whoever was coming for me wanted me scared, isolated, and cornered. I couldn't give them the satisfaction. After the night I was followed, I decided to take matters into my own hands. No more hiding. No more waiting for the next email or shadow lurking in the dark. I needed to know who was behind this, and I needed to end it before they destroyed me. I started with the emails. I knew they were anonymous, but I wasn't entirely clueless when it came to technology. After hours of research and digging through forums, I found a way to trace the IP address of the sender. It wasn't easy, but I managed to narrow it down to a general location, a luxury apartment complex in the heart of the city. It didn't make sense at first. Who in an upscale apartment would care enough to target me? But then I remembered something. Marcus Grant owned a penthouse in that very building. My blood ran cold. Was it Marcus? No, it couldn't be. He was in custody, awaiting trial. But the thought stuck with me, nagging at the back of my mind. Marcus had people, connections, allies. Someone who still lived in that building might be working on his behalf. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. The next evening, I found myself standing outside the apartment complex, clutching a coffee cup as if I belonged there. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I needed to figure out who had sent the emails. I waited for over an hour, my nerves fraying with every passing minute. Just as I was about to give up, I saw someone emerge from the building. My heart skipped a beat. It was Cheryl, Marcus's former assistant. I froze. Cheryl? She looked different, disheveled, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her usually sharp business attire was replaced by sweatpants and a hoodie. She clutched a large bag in one hand, glancing over her shoulder nervously as she hurried down the street. Why would Cheryl be here? She lived in a modest apartment across town. She'd told me so herself during one of our late-night work sessions. Something didn't add up. I followed her at a distance, careful to stay out of sight. She walked quickly, weaving through side streets and alleyways as if she were trying to lose anyone who might be tailing her. My suspicions grew with every step. Finally, she stopped outside a small, dingy office building. She glanced around one last time before slipping inside. I waited a few minutes before approaching the building. The glass door was unlocked, so I pushed it open and stepped into a dimly lit lobby. A single elevator sat at the back of the space, its button glowing faintly in the darkness. I pressed it, my heart pounding in my chest. The elevator creaked as it carried me up to the 5th floor. When the doors opened, I found myself in a narrow hallway lined with doors. One of them was slightly ajar, light spilling out into the hallway. I approached cautiously, peeking through the crack in the door. Inside was a room filled with monitors, each displaying security footage, emails, and financial records. Cheryl sat at a desk in the center of the room, typing furiously on a keyboard. My breath caught in my throat. She wasn't just following me, she was tracking everything. My movements, my emails, even my web searches. And then I saw it, a large stack of cash sitting on the desk beside her laptop. "What the hell are you doing, Cheryl?" I demanded, stepping into the room. She jumped, knocking over a cup of coffee in the process. "You shouldn't be here," she snapped, scrambling to block the monitors from my view. "I could say the same thing to you," I shot back. "You've been following me, haven't you? Sending the emails, threatening me. Why?" Her face twisted with frustration, but I saw the guilt flicker in her eyes. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't have a choice. What are you talking about? She sighed, collapsing into the chair. It's Marcus, she admitted. Even from behind bars, he's still pulling the strings. He knew someone from the inside had exposed him, and he's been paying me to find out who. I didn't know it was you at first, but you figured it out, I finished for her, my voice laced with anger. I needed the money, she snapped. Do you know what it's like to go from making 6 figures to nothing overnight? I've got bills to pay, and Marcus, he offered me more money than I've ever seen in my life. I stared at her, my mind racing. Cheryl wasn't just following me, she was working for Marcus, feeding him information, trying to scare me into silence. But then I noticed something else on the monitors. One of the screens displayed a live feed of Marcus's prison cell. What is that? I asked, pointing to the screen. Cheryl hesitated, then sighed. It's a live feed, she admitted. Marcus has arrangements. The guards at the prison, they're on his payroll. He has access to phones, computers, even video feeds. He's been watching everything. My stomach churned. Marcus was more dangerous than I'd imagined. Even from prison, he was orchestrating everything, using Cheryl to target me, trying to intimidate me into silence. I knew what I had to do. Without saying a word, I reached for my phone and snapped photos of everything, the monitors, the cash, the live feed of Marcus's cell. Cheryl tried to stop me, but I shoved her aside and bolted from the room, my heart racing. By the time I made it outside, I was already dialing the SEC's emergency hotline. Marcus Grant is still orchestrating crimes from prison, I said breathlessly when the agent picked up. I have proof. You need to act now. The next few days were a whirlwind. The SEC raided Cheryl's office, seizing her equipment and arresting her on the spot. The guards at Marcus's prison were exposed, and Marcus himself was placed in solitary confinement, his privileges revoked. The media went wild with the story. "Disgraced CEO caught running scheme from prison" was the headline plastered across every news outlet. Marcus's empire had finally crumbled, and this time, there was no coming back. As for me, I resigned from Lumen Corp. The company was a sinking ship, and I wanted no part of it. I took a job at a nonprofit, far from the cutthroat world of corporate finance. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. Sometimes, I wonder if I should have done things differently. If I'd known how far Marcus's reach extended, would I still have exposed him? But then I think of all the lives he destroyed, the lies he told, and the people he hurt. In the end, justice wasn't perfect, but it was worth it. Even if it came at a cost.